Right. It is 1 minute past 12, according to my clock. And I can see that we have a healthy number of participants who have joined us. So I think we'll get started. Very warm welcome to everyone who's tuned in. Perhaps very warm welcome is the wrong choice of words on what might be the hottest day ever recorded. But this is a really important topic. And I'm absolutely delighted to have such a fantastic panel of panelists. I'll say just at the outset that Tom Tugendhat MP is also due to join us, but for anyone who's not following the ins and outs of the Conservative leadership contest, Tom is one of the contenders, and it's perhaps arguably the biggest day of his political career, so we will forgive him if he doesn't make it. And if he does make it, great. We will slot him in seamlessly. So to get us started, the Coalition for Global Prosperity, for those who aren't familiar with our work, we make the case for UK leadership in international development. We believe that strong UK leadership in development makes Britain, or helps make Britain, a force for good in the world. And we bring together faith leaders, business leaders, politicians and military leaders to do just that, to make the positive case for UK aid. And so without any further ado, this is a really important topic, and we are here today to discuss the UK's role on the global stage in tackling forced labour, the new measures adopted by the government to combat this issue, and to suggest additional steps the UK can take to put an end to modern slavery. And before we get stuck in with our questions, I'm going to go to each panelist and ask them just to say a few words about themselves, what they do, and perhaps why they do it, just in a couple of minutes. So can I turn to Mary first?
Gosh, you'd have thought I'd got the hang of the mute-unmute button since COVID. It's Mary Woodgate. I work for an organisation called Accenture Development Partnerships, which is a part of Accenture, the large strategy management and technology consulting company. And our group has a mission, and our mission is to bring Accenture's assets and capabilities towards working with civil society in international development and towards the SDGs. I'm pleased to be here.
Thanks, Mary. Can I go to you next, Chloe?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. So my name is Chloe Cranston. I'm the Business and Human Rights Manager at Anti-Slavery International. Anti-Slavery International is considered the world's oldest human rights organization. So we were set up over 180 years ago as part of the original abolitionist movement. And we've worked throughout that time, and we now work to address contemporary forms of slavery in all their forms. I particularly focus on our responsible business work, working to end forced labor in global supply chains. And the reason for doing that is because modern slavery is still systemic in the products we buy and the services we use. And that means that workers are being exploited daily. Thanks.
Thank you, Chloe. Christian.
Ryan, thanks so much, and really good of you to be hosting today. Obviously, I'm on the board of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, which is a great privilege for me, and delighted to support the work. My day-to-day, I'm leading an organization called Justice and Care, which is an anti-human trafficking, anti-modern slavery organization working on the ground in Asia and Europe with police and others to help get people out of slavery, including forced labor. Before that, worked in Number 10 under one of our recent prime ministers, although you sort of lose count of them all at the moment, and led the Centre for Social Justice before that, which worked on modern slavery, including the bill. So really good to be here, and delighted you're making this a priority at CGP.
Thanks, Christian. And last but not least, Saqib.
Thanks, Ryan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Member of Parliament for Meriden. Up until about a week and a half ago, I was Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Secretary of State for Health. Look, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and thank you to CGP to, well, first of all, adapting to the changing weather conditions and making sure we were able to go ahead with this. And if you're looking at I guess the national headlines at the moment, modern slavery is not quite there at the front pages at the moment, given everything everything else that's going on. But that, for me, is why this is really, really important that you carried on and had this debate. I'm of course looking forward to Tom Tugendhat being on here, you know, just because I know he's a great champion for this. And I think for me, part of the reason I wanted to be part of this panel, and I was delighted to accept the invitation for it, was because I think it is something worth fighting for. I think Chloe has said quite appropriately that it is systemic in our supply chains, and you know, you can go through life and not realize it's there, or you can recognize the issue and try and challenge it. And that's why I hope we start to debate today.
Thank you, Saqib. For those who have just joined us in the last few minutes, you're very welcome. And to everyone who's joining us this afternoon, as we go through the discussion, please do add your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But to kick us off, I'm going to come to Chloe with the first question, which is, who do you think should be held accountable? Businesses that profit off these practices, or countries, for example, like China, who perpetrate these practices?
So it's both. It's absolutely not an either or question. And I think that's really, really important to highlight that even where governments are the perpetrators, so in cases of state-imposed forced labor, like in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or like in Turkmenistan, that doesn't mean that because the government is a perpetrator, a company can still profit from that abuse. But we need to be holding the governments accountable there, of course. However, what I really want to highlight, we very much are a champion of Uyghur rights, and we have a huge campaign about Uyghur forced labor. But it's important to understand that state-imposed forced labor, which is what that is, accounts for approximately what estimated 4 million victims in the world. I think that number will rise once we have new estimates due to Uyghur forced labor. However, overall, we have 60 million people at any time in the private sector as victims of forced labor. That's in construction, that's in fashion, that's in agriculture, hospitality, cleaning. And in those cases, we do see clear root causes that are due to businesses. So poverty, discrimination, weak rule of law are all root causes, but so are the way businesses do their business. The fact that they rely on weak auditing or weak monitoring, they've created these very long supply chains. That means they have very little awareness and visibility or responsibility about what's happening in their supply chains. And generally, they've relied on decades of very weak corporate social responsibility measures in order to address modern slavery, which frankly have had very little positive impact for workers and have not created as well a level playing field for business. And this is why at Anti-Slavery International, we're calling for stronger laws, which hold all companies accountable to the same standard and set that level playing field for businesses. And I would really highlight as well that businesses themselves want to be held accountable. So many UK businesses are calling for laws which hold them accountable for modern slavery, such as Primark, Aviva, and others.
Saqib, can I bring you in on this one? Because you've had extensive business experience before being elected to Parliament.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I mean, just before I was in Parliament, I was president of the Chamber of Commerce in the West Midlands, one of the largest in the country, and one of the oldest in the world, actually. And one of my big principles was really about advocating for business being a force for good. And part of that was, of course, politicians and legislators recognizing that businesses play a positive role in society. But the other flip side of that was businesses then actually playing that role and taking that positive role. And I think, again, Chloe has recognized this appropriately, that this is it's a dual responsibility. Of course, you know, you can look at state sponsored forced labor, as we're seeing in China, for example, and that is absolutely our role as a government and as a nation to put that pressure on countries that we know or we suspect of engaging in forced labor, and trying to encourage them to in whatever means possible to try and get them out of that kind of habit and move away from that. And you know, that creates a geopolitical responsibility for us. And because it's such a complex area, actually, I think part of the answer has to be international cooperation. It has to be able to recognize that, you know, there are money laundering aspects to this, there's organized crime aspects to this, and therefore it requires an international coalition of nations to actively force this. And I know the UK has taken the lead when it's come to implementing implementing some of the initiatives that have come out of the United Nations. But then on the flip side, businesses also have a significant responsibility to do that. So if you are a business, for example, whether you're a tech company or a fashion company, and you're sourcing cotton from across the world, it is absolutely your responsibility, I think, that to go and recognize and find out where that cotton is coming from, and make sure that your supply chains are clean, for you, want of a better word. I think that we can legislate for that, and we should legislate for that, but I think we also have to build that narrative for companies to recognize that responsibility and be proactive in that. If people like myself are going to advocate for businesses being a force for good, then it is for them to be proactive and take that initiative. And I'm very keen for businesses to recognize that. And of course, the majority of businesses are actors that work in the positive sense, but we do hear of instances, certainly in the textile industry, for example. We heard a couple of years ago, I think, about Boohoo and in Leicester, and about forced labor, and it just brought home the idea that actually it's not happening on some faraway shore, it's also happening on our doorstep. And clearly there are links when forced labor happens. There's links to all sorts of other social issues, and ultimately it's a great cost to the taxpayer. So I think that there's a dual responsibility here, but it's good for the taxpayer, it's good for society to recognize that responsibility of business and then be proactive in it.
Thanks, Saqib. There's a question from a member of our audience, which I want to come to in just a moment. But before I do, Mary, can I come to you next and ask, does the solution lie in wide-sweeping international regulation and cooperation, or is this issue best solved by enforcement of strict compliance rules in individual companies?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And as Chloe said at the start of her response to your first question, of course it's both. Of course it's both. These are systemic and systematic issues that need systems level thinking, and there's no one silver bullet. But I am going to take a global supply chain angle in my reflections on this, and obviously working in the private sector at the intersection of civil society and business. That's going to be my angle. And I think, of course, it's a platitude to say that in the last few years we've really understood the vulnerability and the interconnectedness of global supply chains more than ever before, whether it is the issues of our garments being manufactured in Bangladesh and the lockdowns causing huge shutdown in supply chains there, or indeed fertilizer from Ukraine. We really are, that has been exposed. I think it sort of speaks to Saqib's point that actually there's a lot of, we're really looking at things now that are being unearthed that perhaps we might have walked past before. And if we think about it from that global supply chain perspective, I think as Chloe said, when we look at the number of people in private supply chains in enforced labour, certainly the two sectors, or I think it's really three, I would say, there's a very interesting for our UK business sector and for our UK citizens are, of course, those that are very customer, consumer focused, the garment sector, and also the agriculture and fishing. So that's that accounts for about 15% in the manufacturing, including garments, and 11% of the accounted for agriculture and fishing. Of that, 16 million people in forced labour in private supply chains. It's also just worth noting, while we're looking at stats, that in privately imposed forced labour context, it is a more a female issue than a male. So it's about a 60-40 split of women in forced labour in private sector supply chains versus men. Which I think is interesting. But yes, as we look at that, I think there's therefore a really great opportunity for multinational companies and our UK consumers who buy from them, those brands, to make a difference. And yeah, in the good old days in Accenture and strategy, we used to say that businesses would transform due to two factors. which we said were Amazon or ambition. So Amazon, basically competitor really reinventing the market, or ambition, an organization's desire to do things differently. I think there are two other things now which we're seeing much more. One is I could say two more A's: acts of parliament, so the regulation of course will cause change, and then sort of acts of God and war, which we're sort of suddenly much more familiar with in the last few years. And on a serious note, Accenture, we really believe that that sustainability is the new digital, in terms of providing an opportunity to reinvent organizations, companies for growth, if done well. And we know that the future is really accelerating, the change of the future is really accelerating very, very quickly. So there is an opportunity for forward-looking businesses to really embrace that change. So I think that the two things I would just like to add on this point, when we think about the role of private sector in global supply chains, is that we're very clear these days, very familiar talking about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. When we think about carbon in supply chains, we're getting very familiar with that, the extended supply chains. What we believe that actually the next thing is to think about social emissions. What is the social dirt in your supply chain, and how can we be accountable for that? And then the final point, which I think Chloe, you mentioned earlier, is this point around these very long and complex supply chains, and the reality of that complexity, and in the same way as when you look to decarbonize your supply chain, it's your scope 3, your tier 3 suppliers that are the hardest to track down. But I think that's what needs focus. That needs focus, and there are very interesting ways to do that with data and cooperation. But I will pause and hand back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Mary. I want to turn now to a question from a member of our audience who's anonymous, which always sounds bad, but I'm sure is absolutely fine. So my question is, and I might come to you, Christian, if that's all right. First, the question is, do businesses really want accountability, or do they just want to be able to cleanse their images? Some fashion companies are happily profiting from slavery all over the world at the moment. The opportunity to change is already in their hands, and they are making a choice. Christian.
I totally understand where that question is coming from, because unfortunately, often things have to get to a breaking point, or scandal has to hit before people take responsibility that they've long been able to take. Now, I think the picture is mixed, and we should be honest about that. You've got people like Mary and others really leading the way in the private sector, some absolutely outstanding businesses that have gone way ahead of the legislation to say this matters to us. I mean, we looked at the Global Business Coalition Against Trafficking when we passed the UK Modern Slavery Act, and it was giant businesses like that were pushing the UK government to do this work on transparency in supply chain. So they were way ahead of it, and there are some outstanding leaders out there. The other thing we can say with certainty is that others are brave enough to look at this and finding problems. Again, they should be commended. Actually, we've got to be honest and say, well, when we recognize there are challenges and people find that, let's actually work with them and praise them for putting their heads above it. But no doubt, there are many more that are not playing ball. They're not actually living up to what is required of them in law, and they're very happy to keep operating in a certain way with slavery and supply chains until this goes public, until they're found out. So it's a mixed picture, and it's why we need both to encourage people and celebrate successes, but also then to get tougher. And I think we might come on to this, but we need to make sure that ignoring this or naivety is no longer acceptable and no longer an excuse. So it's mixed. And I would say also, just on the previous question, when you've got to strive all you can for international agreements. And I think the G7 actually put this on the agenda, to be fair to them, after Cardiff Bay last summer. It's all through the lens of trade, but nevertheless, G7 said this matters to us. So you've got to strive for those international agreements, but every country needs to put its own house in order. And so some people hide behind that sense that we can't achieve anything unless we get everything internationally, and that isn't something we should stick with.
Thanks, Christian. There's been some questions in the chat about about regulation, which we'll come to shortly. But before we do, I just want to pose the next question to you, Saqib. At CGP, we always think about international development in the context of the 3Ds, so defence and diplomacy. And with that in mind, how can the UK effectively leverage our foreign policy tools like diplomacy to put an end to global trafficking and forced labour?
That's a great question. Thanks, Ryan. I mean, look, first of all, it's kind of just picking up something Christian just said. I think part of it is getting your house in order domestically, first of all, because if you are to have moral leadership on any issue, you are going to have to get your house in order domestically and demonstrate that you are leading the way in this. Now, I'm not saying that you'll be able to eradicate this as a domestic issue overnight. Clearly, it's an underground economy. It's, clearly there are links to organized crime. Clearly, there's all sorts of other complex issues that require addressing. And if it was that easy, we would have done it already. But however, having said that, clearly we can take leadership in that. And one example, for example, was what we did at the Department of Health and Social Care just a couple of months ago, where we were effectively led on, reviewing the NHS's procurement. So, in a nutshell, to try and avoid any linkages to forced labour. I think it's the first time a government department has done that, to look at its procurement and where it's coming from, and effectively eradicate it from its supply chain, so to speak. So I think that's the first thing. But then if you are then going to do that, and then when you go and engage with international actors, whether it be China or whether it be other nations, Bangladesh or Saudi Arabia or anywhere else in the world, to be honest, you need to be able to point to that and say, this is what we have done. And on the whole, the UK has been leading on this. It's done a number of things in terms of the Modern Slavery Act. It's incorporated the UN principles on this. It's looked at how the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act, for example, in 2018 also looks at some of this. But I know in the Queen's speech, it was mentioned that we'd have the Modern Slavery Bill, which I thought was really exciting. And once you've got those kind of tools at your disposal, you can then engage in foreign policy and diplomacy, and use your diplomatic tools to try and, what I would say in a geopolitical sense, effectively nudge your friends and allies and international actors that you're engaging with into a position where we can be better. Now, if I talk about China, for example, clearly we live in a very integrated, globalized economy. While there are a whole array of opinions across the parliamentary party, I think it's fair to say that about how you engage with China, not just on Xinjiang, but on a whole array of issues. Frankly, my personal perspective is, obviously, given the way we are integrated, we have to recognize that. But that doesn't mean we can't take some moral leadership and therefore set a standard and say this is what's okay. But that's why, just going back to one of your earlier questions, I think it's actually easier to put the responsibility on businesses so that they can then review it through their supply chains, because I think it's not always geopolitically convenient for governments to be able to say this is what we need to have, this is what we want to happen. Or even if they take that moral stand, it can always be difficult to get the results that you need or that you want, and you can be batted away, for example. And we see that on a number of instances. So again, you have those tools, but I think the short answer is you need to get your house in order domestically before you can effectively pontificate internationally.
Thanks, Akib. We've had a question from a member of the audience on the limitations of the Modern Slavery Act, which, Chloe, I'd like to come to you for in just a second. But before I do, Christian, if I can come back to you, my next question relates to the pandemic, which of course we've all lived through. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a sharp rise in unemployment, particularly in the global south, leading to a higher risk of exploitation. Are there any additional steps that we haven't discussed so far that the UK might take to help combat this?
It has made it a lot worse. What was a serious problem before COVID has become an extremely serious one. And I was in Bangladesh a couple of months ago with people we were providing emergency food for months and months, because they lost all support and income through that period. And interestingly, just on the previous point, very quickly, When you go to Bangladesh, as I do, and other places, it totally changes the tone of the discussion when you say, we've got a shared problem to deal with. You know, for too long, people from our country and elsewhere have said, well, how can we help solve your problem? Can we spend more money in your country to deal with this issue? When you go and say, the UK is really grappling with a modern slavery problem, including forced labor, just as you are, how can we learn together? How can we work together? The openness is a different thing altogether. So in terms of COVID and the response, first of all, there are some superb organizations that countries should just get behind. I mean, there's a lot of work being done in very vulnerable communities, whether it's through income generation, businesses being started up, a sense of tackling root causes like cultural issues like child marriage, extreme poverty, lack of awareness. All of that stuff must continue and must become an even greater priority now for organizations like mine if we're going to help to prevent this huge tidal wave of exploitation that could come in the context of COVID. But also that legislative framework is so important. You know, we've got to strive for some standards. We've got to strive to avoid huge corner cutting now, the race back to market for businesses, the lack of spotlight and exposure in some of these areas. You need governments like ours to be putting this on the agenda, as Saqib did brilliantly at the Department of Health. I think that he's probably being very modest. That achievement that came through there was groundbreaking, to say that we won't be bringing in products that might help us in an emergency, but we care that people have been enslaved that make these products, and that's not a corner we're prepared to cut. And that, you know, we've got to do much more of that now in this country. So it's a combination of operational work to help people stay safer, legislative framework, and pressure, going back to your last question, Ryan, on diplomatic pressure. But that sense we've all got an issue here to come together. That's why I'm excited about the G7 saying this matters, because if they follow through on that, those 7 nations, we have a fighting chance of preventing this huge wave of exploitation that could come as a result of COVID and the desperation people feel now.
Thanks, Christian. Chloe, my question is, it's got 2 parts. Could I ask you to offer some comments and reflections on the new modern slavery bill that was part of the Queen's speech, and particularly to perhaps comment on its likely impact? But in addition to that, Neil Fawns asks, do the panelists think we need new legislation specifically to mandate human rights and environmental due diligence to prevent abuse modelled on UK Government Bribery Act? And Neil says that Modern Slavery Act only covers something once it happens. Chloe.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I can probably also answer the question afterwards, not about maybe who in Parliament, but maybe some quick comments on enforcing the Modern Slavery Act. I think it all goes together. Look, I think the key point here, and I'm focusing on Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which is the Transparency and Supply Chains Clause, so not the rest of the Modern Slavery Act. So when the government introduced that in 2015, it was world leading. We very much did welcome it. However, the unfortunate situation is that 7 years later, the UK has fallen behind, and we've now seen that the approach of Section 54 of TISC, Transparency and Supply Chains Clause, is completely insufficient to both drive positive impact for workers and to create a level playing field for business, talking about, you know, businesses being forced for good, continuously undercut by those which are not taking any efforts. And even with the improvements that have been announced in the Modern Slavery Bill, so that's, for example, mandatory reporting requirements, financial penalties for not publishing a statement, that's wholly insufficient. And going back to your first question, where you had both an NGO, which is myself, and a company of Mary saying, yes, companies need to be held accountable, the improvements to the Modern Slavery Bill are not going to hold companies accountable for modern slavery or any other forms of human rights abuse. I won't get into technicalities of it, but essentially what TISC is it's a reporting exercise alone. Companies simply have to report on what steps they have taken to address modern slavery, and if they haven't taken any steps to address modern slavery currently, they can say so. Even with the improvements to the Modern Slavery Bill, to be frank, companies will simply hire lawyers to publish a compliance statement. That is the reality. That drives no positive impact for workers. It also doesn't create a level playing field between businesses that are taking efforts and those businesses which aren't. So we substantially need far stronger legal approaches. And I actually want to take a moment to quote the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is led by Tom Tugendhat, because I think it's really important to actually know what MPs have said on this. So last year, in an inquiry on the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Uyghur forced labour, the Foreign Affairs Committee said they reject the idea that government guidance, as well as non-binding rules such as UN guiding principles on business and human rights, will encourage businesses to do the right thing. For you to understand, the non-binding rules of the UNGPs is essentially what the Modern Slavery Act will mean. It encourages companies to do due diligence, but it doesn't mandate them to do so. And so what the Foreign Affairs Committee said, we recommend that the government introduce new legislation that will create a legal requirement for businesses and public sector bodies to take concrete measures to prevent and remove the use of forced labour in their value chains. This new duty should be backed up by meaningful sanctions and penalties for non-compliance. If Tom Tugendhat had been here, I would have said, great, if you win this leadership campaign, we hope to see you introduce this. But that leads me to, there are very clear policy options that we have here on modern slavery, and they require us to go beyond the Modern Slavery Act and far beyond what's been proposed in the Modern Slavery Bill, what we expect of them. The first is what we're calling for, which is a Business, Human Rights and Environment Act, which mandates companies to undertake due diligence to prevent human rights abuses and environmental harm in line with their responsibilities under the UNGPs, and indeed modelled on the UK Bribery Act. So we're actually very fortunate. We have a benefit here in the UK that we have an existing legal model in the Bribery Act that's been proven to work, that hold companies accountable for failure to prevent bribery. And legal analysis by the British Institute of International Comparative Law has shown that that model can be used in human rights abuses, and that would create legal certainty for businesses, which is what businesses want. And businesses have been calling for mandatory due diligence laws. I said some names at the beginning, but Primark, Aviva, John Lewis, ASOS, and others have all been calling for these stronger laws, recognizing that Modern Slavery Act is insufficient. The other piece of legislation we need, and again, I want to emphasize this is also not an either or, we need import controls. So the US government bans the import of goods made with forced labor, and that's particularly powerful when you're talking about Uyghur forced labor. And so that would be banning products made with Uyghur forced labor, cotton, for example, into the UK. And we need both these approaches, so Business, Human Rights, Environment Act and import controls. And so just to then go on to the point about getting tough on businesses in regard to enforcing Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, the problem is not about penalties for non-compliance with TISC. That is solely about if a company has published a statement or not. That is not about whether they have prevented abuses. It's not about whether they profited from modern slavery. So we need new approaches, and that's been recognised by business, it's been recognised by MPs, including a current leadership candidate, and it's been recognised by numerous NGOs and trade unions.
Thanks, Chloe. I want to pick up on your comment about the link to China and put that to Saqib, because there's a question in the chat from Chris which relates to that, but I'll come back to you, Saqib, in a second. Before I do, Mary, can I bring you in and just ask you to offer your reflections, but also point specifically, should the penalty for non-compliance be made stricter?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and thanks to all of the panel. The one nuance I did want to bring out here, and it's based on our experience recently with an FCDO-funded program supporting vulnerable supply chains, in this case, garment workers in Bangladesh who lost so much during the COVID lockdowns. And we were working with amazing partners such as Goodweave and others to really look at instances of forced labour. One of the key learnings we took from that is around what you do when you find something. And actually there is something worth noting, that retaliation is one thing, or obviously accountability is another, but really focusing on what you do, the remediation is so important. I think people that work in this space would really emphasize that. And so for me, I have a question about what is the correct penalty, because one has to be aware of the law of unintended consequences, because of course the way to have a pure supply chain that won't risk this is to basically pull out of areas of risk, and you can do that. and notwithstanding your point about potentially banning certain imports, but the risk then is that actually you plunge many more people into poverty because the global supply chains then move out of that area. So for me, I think there does need to be a really conscious thought towards remediation and what that looks like. So that would be the one point I would emphasize.
Thanks, Mary. Saqib, I'll come to you for the next one. Chris from the Press Association says or asks, how do we cope in sectors where avoiding forced labour is incredibly difficult? Solar panels being a particular concern here, given it's dominated by Chinese companies linked to slavery, but also forms a major part of our net zero plans.
Excellent question. Ryan, before I answer that, I'm actually just going to pick up on something both Mary and Chloe said, because I think for me, and I'm sure Tom would say this if he was here, that as legislators, I think that debate that we've just seen is exactly the conundrum that we have in terms of balancing, what is appropriate from a business supply chain perspective, and then on the other hand, achieving the objectives that we need to achieve. I think it's very important just to highlight that, because actually related to the question that you've just asked, clearly we've got on the one hand our net zero ambitions, and on the other hand we've got the supply chain which has got question marks over it, and that's me being kind about it, to be honest. And I think the reality is there's probably a couple of things I'd probably say about this. First of all, one thing we haven't actually spoken about is the role of the consumer and the role that education takes. And so a non-legislative way that I think the government can lead on this is basically trying to own the narrative and actually building on that narrative. And I know Tom's done some great work as chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, as Chloe's just highlighted. But whoever the next leader is, I'm sure Tom will be taking it to them. And my commitment here today is that I'll also be taking this cause to the next leader. So we try and build that into the narrative of whoever is at the top, because I think, if you've been watching the debates, I'm sure there's lots of different things being spoken about, but one thing I think you can see is that there's a lot of good, well-intentioned people at the top who want to do the right thing, and I think it is for us to first of all lead the way in doing that. And just to build on that, I mean, part of my thinking around this is really if consumers are educated, say if it's solar panels, or if it's about supply chains in fashion or textiles, and I see this with my own eyes. I've got siblings who are always looking at, where is this product made, where did the materials come from? That our next generations are much more attuned, I think, in terms of supply chains, and I think that will only get stronger and stronger. But we can lead on that. But then on the flip side, actually, we can look at existing legislation like the Bribery Act, like Chloe's pointed out, and see what we can do. Despite being a free market conservative who believes in small state, actually, I think this is one of those places that actually we should absolutely legislate on, and we should absolutely make sure that there are appropriate sanctions in place. I use that phrase very carefully in the context of what Mary said, because actually, first of all, I think, from any perspective, I'd like to see that any company that recognizes that there is a fault in the supply chain, or there is forced labor being used, that they take adequate and appropriate measures to effectively deal with that, first of all. And then I think you can have almost a sliding scale of culpability in terms of, if they are actively engaging in something, whether it's internationally or domestically, as we've seen in recent headlines, how we then go ahead and deal with that. And ultimately, if it's a business, the accountability, the responsibility will rest right, with the directors of the business, because ultimately that's where it has to be. And I should also say, you mentioned my previous role. I'm a chartered accountant by profession. I'm an auditor, and I think the audit profession will have a massive role in dealing with this. And and I think the institutes of the accountancy institutes, etc. Training will play a massive role in this. So education, training, consumers voting with their feet is really, really important. But I think it has to be backed up with legislation, which why I always say, we need to get our house in order domestically.
Chloe.
Yeah, because I think you're about to change the subject a little bit. So I just wanted to answer to the points. I want to highlight that I'm actually fully in agreement. And I think maybe a misconception is around transparency of modern slavery. So for Anti-Slavery International perspective, from my perspective, if a large company is saying we have found an instance of modern slavery, that is a good thing. There's realistically very, very few companies of significant size that will be able to say we have no modern slavery in our supply chains. If they're saying that, it's either a lie or they have not looked for it, or they're using very inadequate methods to look for it. What we are looking at for is companies to be transparent about where they are finding modern slavery, because they will, and then to be transparent about what steps they have taken to address that, remediate it, as Mary has said, and then to prevent that happening in the future. And that's actually exactly what the UK Bribery Act model would do. It's about holding companies accountable for a failure to prevent abuses, and companies have to prove that they have taken all reasonable measures to prevent that abuses. So it's not holding a company accountable for every single instance of modern slavery. They have to prove they've identified it, and this is what they have done about it. And that's very much in line with what the UN guiding principles want us to see happen. There is, and also I want to also emphasize that there's no intention about creating a law that drives a so-called cut and run from various contexts. We do need companies to disengage from the Uyghur region. Absolutely, that is categorical. We also need companies to disengage from Turkmenistan, where you have state-imposed forced labor. But elsewhere, what we need to see laws doing is to push companies to work in an equitable way with their suppliers, with workers, with trade unions, and with communities and governments and all other stakeholders to address the root causes of abuses. So it's about staying and making sure those abuses don't happen. So I want to say it's a bit of a misnomer around these laws are just trying to catch companies out. That's not in any way what the intention is. It's making sure companies are taking meaningful efforts to prevent forced labor.
I want to just pick up on a point that was made a few moments ago about the consumer and looking at it from their angle. And I think this question is one that perhaps wouldn't be as important were we not in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And I might come to you, Mary, first, if that's okay. And the question is, what can we do to tackle modern slavery whilst also ensuring that prices of goods don't increase excessively for families and consumers who are already struggling financially?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think this is a reality. I think on the one hand, as Saqib said, you know, the new generations are much more socially minded, socially conscious, of course. But I think we also need to be students of history and also realize that and not assume a constant progression of enlightenment, or, you know, for want of a better word, that's probably the wrong word, from our consumers, particularly when you're really forced with facing really tough choices about your budget. So I think this is a very good question to ask. I think I hope there will always be customers. I mean, it's a dated survey, but one survey about 5 years ago, you know, said that about 66% of customers were willing to pay a premium for more socially and ethical products. So I think there will still be that privileged group, or those that are able to prioritize that. But I don't think that can be. We can't rely on that alone, and we can't rely on that also those costs being passed on. And look, I'm not an economist, but I do think we need to think about this kind of reinvention idea, rather than thinking very, very linear in terms of kind of the costs of products and therefore them having to be forced on to the end consumer. And in this same, I'm going to keep pushing this concept of the sort of social emissions, or the sort of the net zero, the social net zero race, because we're not assuming in all cases, because it would be foolish to, that customers will be able to pay the cost of, you know, of the UK country becoming net zero. We don't, you know, in some parts customers will pay for that, but in other ways, other parts of the community and society will need to invest. And I think we need to think along the same lines for social issues in our supply chains. But I'll pause there and hand back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Mary. I want to ask about machinery of government, which is a bit of a geeky topic, but so many of the leadership candidates have mentioned this idea that that Whitehall perhaps doesn't work in the way that it ought to, and it always seems to be a theme of politics. You know, if we have a new department or a new minister, stuff will change. And I'll, if it's all right, I'll come to Christian first as a former senior advisor in Number 10, and then to you, Saqib, as a former government aide and I'm sure future minister. And the question is the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Department for International Trade up to the challenge of tackling this issue? Or what other tools does the UK need?
Well, I thought it was a mistake to wrap up DFID into the FCDO, and we, you know, that's history now. But I felt potentially there was a real loss of expertise. But I think the FCDO, the Foreign Office, should be up to the task. There are some phenomenal people in there. If you work, first of all, if you prioritize this, and I think we do lack internationally the focus on it. You see the G7 starting to do it at the UN, but if you compare, for example, I think there's sort of, if you look at the number of refugees, 29 to 30 million refugees worldwide, 9 billion annual investment globally, HIV/AIDS, you've got 37 million people affected, a budget rising to nearly 30 billion next year. With modern slavery, you've got 40 million people, and we think about 500 million, so 500 million or so is the global total investment. There's more people affected, massive underinvestment. And that is partly because I think we lack a little bit of grip and leadership internationally. So the FCDO, Foreign Office, certainly could, if the next leader, the next prime minister or Labour government says this matters to us. Because we saw back in 2015, when a senior politician said the UK made this a priority, things did move. A lot was far from perfect. And then it sort of has faded backwards. But I think that it can do. Trade is one element, though. I think there's a slight risk of putting all our hope in the trade basket right now. And the G7's pushed into the trade discussions. We know the sensitivities and complexities when thrashing out a trade deal with regime. Take India, for example, which has a huge number of people affected by forced labor. But the desperation for this trade deal is there. The debate about China, which Saqib has mentioned. So I think trade, if you put it into a range of solutions, could be effective. So I wouldn't put it all in Department for Trade, International Trade. But I think the UK can lead. It's got to work with people who know what they're doing. That means senior businesses. It means good NGOs. It means experts out there, and it means international cooperation. So I don't have any major concerns about it being at the Foreign Office. It's really about what you do with it and who's going to lead, for me, is the more important question.
Thanks, Christian. Saqib.
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree with Christian more. I mean, I use that example of the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, when he made that decision at the Health Department. All this takes, and it really is this simple, is for the person at the top to have the ambition, the drive, and the desire to make a change, right? And Christian's right. I mean, I was before being PPS to Sajid Javid, I was PPS to Liz Truss when she was Secretary of State for International Trade, and this was at the time where tens and tens and tens of trade deals were being signed. It was an incredibly frenetic time, and trade is only one part of that, because of course you could put it in the trade deals, but then really ultimately it comes down to how you enforce it, what the delivery is, and then we do a kind of a full circle to how we get companies to look at it into their supply chain. So I think you can, the machinery of government can do it, but you need the person at the top driving it. And I think it's really, really important. And I might give away some trade secrets here, but everyone who's here on this call, get in touch with your members of parliament and let them know that this is a major, major issue. Because take it from me, we're not focusing on the leadership stuff right at the moment, but what I will say is, take it from me that those people who come in, or that person who comes in, they will be very much in listening mode in those early months. And we have a great opportunity to drive this agenda forward. And there'll be lots of competing things going on. Cost of living, for example, is obviously on everyone's plate, and the inbox is filled with issues on that. But there are other things that we can drive and say, actually, there are sustainable, real things we can do to tackle this issue domestically and internationally. And just to put one final point internationally, we need to build that international coalition of partners. It's the only way you're going to do that, to get the right level of enforcement. And then again, that comes down to listening to the right people and using their expertise.
Thanks, Akib. I want to pick up in a sec on international partners. Before I do, Chloe, I can never remember which group is the gamekeeper and which is the poacher, but you're not a government insider, or at least haven't been a PPS recently. Could you offer your reflections on how Whitehall operates and what difference it might make if we were to mix things up?
Yes, I definitely think the others on the call maybe have more in-depth expertise on this. However, I think for me, the one thing I would highlight is the need for internal cooperation. So, for example, if we are calling, as I said, for the use of import controls and forced labor, but that needs to be closely coordinated with the role of the Foreign Office, which can use the role of development, so the FCDO, I mean, which can use the role of development in order to drive, addressing the root causes such as poverty, discrimination, and how does development programs come into that. Similarly, if we're speaking about Uyghur forced labor, there's a role for DIT there in terms of trade and import controls, but also we need to see the use of punitive sanctions, such as, for example, replicating the entity list approach in the US. And so we really need to see those different departments working together. On the remit that I work on, business base as well is hugely important. DEFRA is important, but right now we don't see linked up policy. So if we're seeing a future leadership, it's about how do they link that up and make sure that when one policy is introduced, the other areas which need to be introduced in tandem with it so that they work is done, and it's done holistically. And I think that's something, to be honest, we need to see in many governments around the world.
Thanks, Chloe. I'm conscious of time and also not wanting to melt while on screen. So we'll finish shortly, and we'll have one more question. And given this is such a huge topic, and we could quite easily continue for quite a long time, if I may, I'll ask panelists just to wrap up as they answer this question with any final thoughts or any reflections that they haven't had the opportunity to make so far. Mary, I'll come to you first. My question is, what sanctions or tools can the UK and allies adopt to force others to stand up to countries taking advantage of modern slavery?
Thanks, Ryan. And I guess I'm going to take a little bit, if we think about the 4Ds, maybe a little bit more on the development side of things as a tool, because that's where I know a bit more. So I think for me, it is about continuing actually some of the great work and doing more in terms of replicating proven programming that is really effective in addressing forced labor in global supply chains. And I just think we need to keep doing that and doing more and recognizing what works. And by the way, what works is pre-competitive collaboration with businesses. It's about working with local partners on the ground with context and with continuity, particularly in the remediation. And it's also about this question about getting the remediation versus penalization balance correct. So for me, it's doing more of that. I truly believe we need a healthy and thriving civil society sector, both in the UK and globally, to really work on these issues. So whatever the UK government can do to support that. And also this question about SMEs, small, medium enterprises. This, I think, for me, is the kind of final frontier. And so whatever needs to be a cross-departmental action, as everyone has said, and really where that can be used to support innovation and resilience and strengthening and training within the SME sector, both at home and globally, I think is really important. So that I'll pause there and hand over.
Thank you, Mary. Can I come to you next, Christian?
Well, thanks for having us, Ryan. And I've learned a lot from the other panelists and appreciate it enormously. I think we've got a big opportunity in front of us because we understand more than ever about what's happening in our supply chains. Technology is a friend in the effort here, if we use it properly, to get forensic about identifying this and rooting it out. And I think as well that there is a reset coming internationally as we move beyond COVID restrictions. In the UK, of course, we're still working out what it means to make the best of Brexit. And so I feel there's an opportunity to shape more international collaboration than we've ever seen on this particular issue. One thing I would add in is how we support people whose lives have been ruined by slavery and destroyed by this abuse is absolutely vital. Because what we're finding in our casework is if you help them to rebuild, recover, and come through that exploitation, A, it's just the right thing to do morally, but B, they help you get after the traffickers, the criminals, and those who've been exploiting them. They talk. And by supporting people properly, I think we can root this out, more importantly, find people who are perpetrating the abuses and actually sort of achieve some things from the ground up. Yes, we need real action from the very top, but actually people on the ground working with survivors, helping them to bring people to justice, we're going to get a lot further if we can do both of those things at the same time. So I'm really optimistic. I think we can move forward with ambition. And I think Saqib's right. You know, the next Prime Minister is going to be in listening mode for months. And so it's our job to persuade them that this matters and it should be a priority.
Thank you, Christian. Chloe.
I think the main thing I would add, because others have talked about vaguely and I haven't said much, is that urgent need for international cooperation. And I'll speak about it in terms of the legislative piece. So we have the US, Canada, Mexico introducing import controls. The EU is introducing a forced labor instrument, which will ban both forced labor imports and domestic products. We have due diligence laws appearing in the EU, in Norway, in Switzerland, New Zealand is discussing it. And what we really need to see is like-minded countries coming together and introducing comparable legislation. First, companies want that. They want harmonized regulation. They do not want a patchwork of regulation. And secondly, what that helps is to make sure that there's not dumping grounds appearing around the world for forced labor products. The really sad reality we have currently is the US has just introduced a really strong law on Uyghur forced labor, but we have evidence that shows that that means that the EU and UK, in the absence of such laws, are likely becoming dumping grounds for those Uyghur forced labor goods. So we need to see that international cooperation and the countries working together to make sure that the laws align and that they make sense both for workers and for companies.
Thank you, Chloe. And last word to Saqib.
Thanks, Ryan, and I'm just going to echo the thanks to you and the CGP for hosting this today, despite the testing weather conditions. But look, as I started, this is such an important issue, and I'm so pleased we've been able to do this today. And I think if I'm going to have the last word, I'm going to just look at your mantra on the logo, which is Britain as a force for good. If we really believe in that, and you know, I'm an unapologetic idealist when it comes to this stuff. You know, and if you believe in global Britain, tackling this issue, you know, taking moral leadership on this issue, I think it really will speak to our values as a nation, and I think we absolutely have to do that. So I guess my request or my challenge to everybody on this call is to build up that crescendo of noise, so much so that, you know, whether it's our next foreign secretary or our prime minister meets a world leader, one of the very first questions that we talk about, what we say, and I like the way Christian phrased it at the start, which is, we've got a shared problem, how do we deal with this? And you know, we have that narrative. And look, we of course we need to build a framework that companies can adhere to, work with clarity. We need good data so we know we can make effective policies around this, and we talked about that. And obviously good, strong education so consumers can also feed into that, building that noise. So I'm, as I said, I'm unapologetically idealistic about this. I think we should, Britain is and should be a force for good, and we should lead on this. And if we are truly going to achieve our laudable aim of being global Britain, this has to be right at the centre of that.
Thank you very much, Saqib. It's 1 minute to 1, so we will pause there. One of the things I learned during COVID and doing lots of Zoom calls is that panelists, the call ends and that's it, and you never get that small time at the end to actually thank them. So I will say loud and clear now, before the call ends, and that's it. A huge thank you to Chloe, Christian, Saqib and Mary for your time. And a huge thank you to our audience too for logging on a very hot day. I very much hope that in the autumn, with a new Prime Minister, we can come together again and do this in person. So I'm getting it out there now so that you can all look forward to that. But for now, thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you have a very good and hopefully cooler afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Brian.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for bringing us together. Cheers.